Hey, this is Mike Robbins. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. I hope you're doing well. You, your team, your family, everyone around you. I'm recording this both audio and on YouTube on video. So if you're watching this, nice to see you. If you're listening, always good to have you listen. I want to talk today about a topic that can be tricky for most of us, myself included. I want to talk about conflict, how to resolve conflict. And look, in my experience of this, I don't love conflict first and foremost. And it's way easier for me to talk about conflict or write about conflict or teach about conflict or even help other people facilitate and resolve conflict than it is to work through conflicts in my own life. But it's super important. It's necessary in all of our relationships to learn how to work through conflict. It's necessary with our teams. It's necessary in parenting, in families, in what's going on in our communities, our country, our world, an ability to really work through conflict authentically, effectively. It's just really challenging. And most of us aren't very good at it. So let's talk a little bit about what makes it hard or why is conflict so difficult. First of all, it can be scary and uncomfortable, right? And depending on how we grew up, how we were raised, how people dealt with conflict, we can see conflict as either constructive or destructive. And most of us see it, at least initially, as destructive because it's scary, right? I've probably mentioned this here on the show before, but I found this many years ago when I was writing a section in one of my books on conflict. The Chinese symbol for conflict, it roughly translates to conflict or crisis. There's two parts to the symbol. The first symbol is the symbol for danger, and the second symbol is the symbol for opportunity. And it's usually written with the danger symbol in front of or on top of the opportunity symbol. So the danger comes first, the fear, what might happen. Maybe you grew up in a house where people avoided conflict completely and there was a ton of tension. Maybe you grew up in a family, which was kind of how my family was, especially in the early years before my parents got divorced, where there was a lot of yelling and screaming and people just constantly being in conflict, and the conflict wasn't productive. Maybe there was even abuse that took place that impacted you or the people around you. So we're introduced to conflict early on. The way our parents engage in conflict, the way we engage in conflict with our siblings, if we have siblings, the way we engage in conflict with other members of our family, friends, if you're part of sports teams, or depending on where you grow up in the country or in the world, maybe there was a lot of conflict happening right outside your door in your community, depending on, what's happening politically, socially, economically, otherwise, that can have an impact on it all the way around. And the reality is, even if we just take it back to sort of interpersonal conflict, um, most of us weren't taught skills or didn't see it modeled that conflict was dealt with effectively. And so as we grow up and as we start to have relationships and as we start to move into the world and we're no longer kids, we're no longer adolescents, we start to show up at work, we start to have, more serious relationships, intimate relationships, friend relationships. Maybe we get married and have children and they grow and, all of a sudden it becomes a thing, right? I mean, our daughters are 18 and 15 now. So conflict arises between the two of them or in our house as they're now in, full on adolescence. And one of them actually moving through adolescence almost to young adulthood, um, dealing with the conflict or when they were little, babies, toddlers, school age kids, having them throw tantrums and all of these things. Again, depending on where you are in life, or we all deal with conflict to one degree or another. And it can be scary. It can be uncomfortable. We've all had situations where we've had conflicts arise that didn't go well, that didn't end well for us, that relationships ended, or we got hurt, or we got disappointed, or people got upset with us, or we tried to address something and instead of it getting better, it got worse and it didn't work out for us. So we learn a lot of things directly and indirectly about conflict. I see this show up a lot in my work when I'm consulting with teams and organizations. It's like, how does the leader deal with conflict? One of the most consistent pieces of negative feedback I get about leaders across the board, big company, small company, private sector, public sector, you name it, is, oh, my boss or my manager doesn't like conflict, doesn't deal with conflict. When there's conflict on the team, he or she gets really uncomfortable or they try to squelch it or whatever the case may be, because I think right? It can be uncomfortable. It can be awkward. So much of communication these days happens virtually, happens on email, on text, on Slack, on social media, right? A lot of the public conflicts that any of us may get into happen going back and forth with someone on social media about something, which is like, we would probably never be having that conversation in person. And most of those social media debates or discussions that turn into arguments about politics and other things don't usually end well. They don't usually end with someone going, you know what, you made a good point. I'm changing my mind. So conflict is tricky for a whole bunch of reasons, right? The danger part, I might lose something, I might get hurt, someone might get upset with me, I might cause a problem, I might make things worse, I might lose out on opportunities, people might judge me, they might not like me, all the reasons, right? And then again, we're oriented in certain ways, right? We talk about sort of how do we deal with conflict or how do we deal with crisis? Are we someone who fights? Are we someone who, you know, gets really scared? It's the sort of fight or flight. Do we run away? Do we freeze? Any one of those three things, we can all find ourselves in those different places. I'm someone who tends to fight for better or worse. When a conflict arises, I'm kind of a fight fire with fire. I don't love it. I'm not excited about it, but I'm someone that, barks back or responds in kind. Not always, and sometimes I handle it better than others, but that's kind of my orientation to it. If it gets really intense, and back when I was younger, if it actually was going to get physical or a literal fight might break out, I'm actually someone who would run away for sure. And while freeze isn't that's probably the third option for me. I would say first one is fight, second one is flight, run away, third one is freeze. But that one can happen sometimes depending on the situation. And most of us have had situations where something arises, something comes about, and then we walk away from the situation or we reflect on it later and go, gosh, I froze in that moment. I wish I would have said this. I wish I would have said that. I wish I would have moved away. I wish I would have created a boundary or given some feedback or whatever. So understanding ourselves and having compassion for ourselves, not judging ourselves, is super important. But as you've heard me say many times, and one of the pillars in my book, We're All in This Together, is based on this. But I remember having a conversation with a mentor of mine years ago, and he said, Mike, you know what stands between you and the kind of relationships you really want to have with people? I said, what's that? He said, it's usually a 10-minute sweaty palm conversation that you're too afraid to have. He said, if you get good at those 10-minute sweaty palm conversations, you'll have fantastic relationships. You'll build trust. You'll resolve conflicts. You'll work things out. You'll talk about the elephant in the room. You'll give feedback. You'll get feedback. You'll get to know people who are different than you. He said, but if you do like most of us and you avoid those conversations, because, they can be difficult, they can be uncomfortable, they can sometimes go sideways and take a lot longer than 10 minutes. He said, but you end up being a victim of who you work with, who you live with. He said, but if you lean into the discomfort and have those conversations sooner rather than later, you'll have fantastic relationships. And he was right. He was basically talking about conflict in a lot of ways. Being able to lean into the discomfort of that sweaty palm conversation is so important. And in my experience, personally, walking around the planet for the last 50 years, for almost 24 years now, as a coach, as a consultant, as a speaker, as a facilitator of workshops and groups and working with teams, there's really only two ways that I'm aware of that we can resolve a conflict. And I don't mean to oversimplify it, but there's really only two ways. The first way is that we deal with it directly all the way through until the conflict gets resolved. Now, I don't mean you win. I don't mean you get your point across. I don't mean you sort of bang your fist on the table or end the email or the Slack message with like, I won, I proved my point. I mean, it really gets resolved. Like it gets worked out. Like you work through it. Now, again, it's not always going to be that everybody gets everything that they want necessarily, but that people are heard, the communication happens, and ultimately it's resolved. Like both people or everyone involved has a sense of being heard. Whatever needs to be said was said, and we move forward. There's a reconnection. There's a rebuilding, if necessary, of trust. There's a understanding of one another with some compassion and even some appreciation. Now, does that happen easily? Sometimes it can. Sometimes it takes a while. It definitely can involve a series of sweaty palm conversations, and it's not always just 10 minutes, right? But that's dealing with it directly. That's addressing it directly. That's not triangulating. That's not gossiping. That's not going to tell other people about it. I mean, we can talk to other people or check in with other people to get some support, to get some feedback, we can have other people help facilitate it. but I'm talking about dealing with it directly. You have an issue with me, you come to me and talk about it, we work it out. We have an issue as a team collectively, we address it directly and we talk through it and we work through it. We have an issue as a family, whatever the case may be. And when we're dealing with things directly, there's a couple things to remember. Almost everybody has some level of fear, if not a significant level of fear, as it relates to dealing with the conflict, right? Danger in front of opportunity. So the fear is real. So one of the ways that I start almost every sweaty palm conversation that I have, or when I go in to have one of those difficult conversations or to resolve a conflict, I will usually start by lowering the water line on my iceberg, if you will, being vulnerable, even as scary and uncomfortable as that can be, and essentially saying, I'm scared to have this conversation with you. Or I've been avoiding this conversation, or I was awake at 3 o'clock in the morning last night thinking about this, or I've had a knot in my stomach all morning knowing we're going to talk about this, or whatever, not to freak them out, not to try to manipulate them, but just to honestly, authentically, vulnerably let them know this matters to me and I'm concerned about it. I've talked to multiple people about this already because I've been trying to come up with the right thing to say, or I know we've talked about this before, or I know the last time I brought this up, you got pissed at me, or whatever it is, because the natural human response to vulnerability is empathy. So starting the conversation with some vulnerability, even if it's scary, even if we're feeling kind of heated and defensive about the person or the topic or the situation or what's going on, it can be counterintuitive. Look, and there's a risk involved, right? What is vulnerability? Risk, emotional exposure, and uncertainty, according to our friend, the great Dr. Brene Brown. But can we go into that conversation with the waterline on the iceberg down a little bit? Can we be a bit emotionally exposed? Can we take a risk? Step into the uncertainty. I don't know how this is going to go. I want this to go well, and I'm worried that it might not. So that's one place to start. Another thing that's really important to do when we do engage in conflict is to remember it takes two to tango. It's not just them. If we come into it, it's all about them and we're blaming them and it's your fault and you did this and did it. Even if practically speaking, the issue arose from something that they did or we're upset about something they did or said, it's a conflict. It's a problem because we have a problem with it. So as much ownership as we can take for the situation, for what's going on, and for at minimum for our reaction to it, right? I mean, there can be a situation in parenting, let's say, or even in management where someone does something, someone breaks a rule, someone violates something, and it's like, I have to go talk to them. I have to essentially reprimand them or hold them accountable to something. That can really look like person A did this. I'm person B coming in just reacting to the situation. But the truth of the matter is, there's not just one way to react. There's many, many different ways. We could respond in lots of different ways. So we can own, I'm upset about this. I'm frustrated. We need to talk about this. I'm concerned. I'm feeling scared. Again, the more we can own our own, what's going on down below our waterline. They did the thing, yeah, but what's the impact it had on us? And can we own that? And another piece of that is, can we speak to them authentically? Yes, not sugarcoating it, not watering it down, but using I statements. I think, I notice, I feel, not to make it all about us necessarily, but as soon as we go into that you, maybe they did something, but if we start to accuse them, if we start to judge them, if we come in with that self-righteousness, I'm right, you're wrong, you did the wrong thing, you're bad, let me tell you why, they're going to get defensive. Even if they technically did something wrong, even if what you're saying, there's truth to it, the mere act of accusing them, the mere act of blaming them is going to elicit a very natural human response of defensiveness. That's not going to have the conversation go well. That's not going to have them be as open-minded as you want them to be with respect to them actually hearing what you have to say. So the more you can, right, lower the waterline going in, be real, be vulnerable, take ownership of the situation, whatever parts you've contributed to it, and fully take ownership of your reaction to it, and then use I statements. Make sure that you're communicating in a way to let them know, this is what I think, this is how I feel, this is the way I see it, not this is how you are. It's subtle, but it's pretty significant. Another really important thing, and this is super tricky, I know I struggle with this, is to listen. Slow down and listen. Listen to what they say. Listen to where they're coming from. Feel into where they might be, whether we're talking in person, whether we're talking on Zoom, whether we're talking on the phone. It's most ideal to talk to someone live and in real time when attempting to resolve a conflict. Very difficult to resolve a conflict going back and forth on email or on Slack or on text or whatever. Not impossible, but just very difficult. Because then we sort of are lobbing things back and forth and defending ourselves, and there's not it it can feel safer to do that, but it can be tricky, right? I mean, maybe we voice memo back and forth. My wife, Michelle, and I like to voice memo to each other, not to resolve conflicts at all, but just to communicate. Sometimes, depending on the dynamic, maybe I need to get something out. I'm going to leave you this voice message on text or on, an actual voicemail, but I want to have a conversation. Or I'm going to send you this email because I want to get my thoughts out, and I'm afraid I won't say everything when we meet, but I want to have a conversation because the one-way communication often is really tricky. So can we listen? I have a tendency when I get into a heated conversation with someone to get defensive, to talk a lot, to interrupt them, to talk over them, right? Because I'm trying to defend myself. And when I get emotionally triggered, it's hard for me to take a breath and really listen. But that's super important for us to be able to do, hear where they're coming from. And then ultimately, can we make some requests? Can we have some ideas, suggestions, potential solutions for how to resolve the conflict, how to work through it? Now, sometimes our ideas and the other person or other people's ideas are going to be very different. So it's going to be hard to come to some consensus about what we're going to do or how we go forward, right? That's where this can be really tricky. In a business setting, sometimes a decision has to get made, and maybe it's not what I think is best. In parenting, that can happen too. In life in general, we're got to pick one path to go down, and there's multiple options, and then ultimately we pick the path. But what do we need to do or say to be resolved, to make sure that we speak up, that we feel heard and valued? And it may not go our way, and we want to be fully on board with the decision, not rooting against it so we can be right if it doesn't go well, which our little egos can sometimes do. So those are some things that we can do. We can also lean on other people, get someone else involved, get a third party, a mediator, someone who's not emotionally or practically invested in the situation to talk to you. Because sometimes in certain people and certain personalities and certain dynamics and certain topics, it no longer works for us to just go have that conversation with them directly. We've tried many times and it just throws gasoline on the fire. Can we bring in someone else who can help facilitate it? This is where coaches and therapists and mediators and facilitators can become really, really valuable and important. And inside of a company or even a family, there's usually someone you can lean on and pull in if you're willing to do that, who can absolutely help. So that's option one, which is dealing with it directly. Now, is it easy? No. Are we going to mess it up? Of course. Can it sometimes exacerbate the situation and initially make it worse before it makes it better? Absolutely. But if we really are willing to lean into those sweaty palm conversations, we can absolutely work through conflicts. And letting people know what they've done or what they've said and the impact it's had on us is different than blaming them. So if you come to me and say, Mike, you're rude, or you talk too much, or you're selfish, or why do I'm going to get defensive, right? I'm not rude. I talk a bit, but I don't talk too much, or I'm not selfish. I'm going to defend myself. But if you come and tell me a specific instance, hey, Mike, when we were on that Zoom yesterday with the team, I had some things I wanted to say and ask, but I felt like I couldn't get a word in edgewise. It seemed like you were talking most of the time, or every time someone brought something up, you immediately had an answer and then you went off. And so I noticed I just shut down about halfway through and thought, you know what, it's not even worth it. That's different than telling me I talk too much, right? Now, maybe I justify, well, I had things to say, or I'm in charge of this project, or I know a lot about it, or blah, blah, but I'm at least going to stop and pause and go, wow, huh. I didn't want to have the impact on you that had you shut down and disengage and feel like you couldn't talk. So now I'm going to be thinking of it differently. But if you come to me and say, you were talking so much on the meeting yesterday, it was super annoying. Why do you do that? It's selfish. Now I'm going to defend myself. You see the difference? The same situation. So can we communicate in that way with some ownership, with some I statements, with some vulnerability, but with some courage and honesty? Absolutely. Now, what's the second way that we can resolve a conflict? This way is way more efficient. This way is actually ideal in a lot of situations. The second option is to just let it go. Now, I don't mean pretend like it's cool and still be resentful. I mean, like delete it from the hard drive, like let it go. Like it's not a problem anymore. Now, look, I'm not saying we let people walk all over us. I'm not saying we don't care. I'm not saying we don't speak up and step up. No, but I'm saying there's so many things that happen on a daily basis within a family, within a team, within a relationship. We let things go all the time. We have to because we can't focus on everything, but we prioritize the things that matter most. But if we let it go, we like let it go. Like, I'm not going to be upset about that thing anymore. Right. Last week's episode, I was talking about be easy to impress and hard to offend. This is a part of the hard to offend thing. I'm not going to get upset about that thing. I'm not going to, right? It's like, what do they say? Pick your battles, or, there's all these weird sayings and metaphors. You really want to die on that hill. I don't really like that one, but you know what I mean? Like, is this really that important? Will this matter in a year? Will this matter in a month? Can I just let it go? That thing that my partner does that annoys me, is that just kind of part of their personality? Can I just accept it and not be bothered by it? If they do something that really has a negative impact on me, can I let them know that, or can we make some agreement or have some parameter about it? But it's like, what are we doing? We often get upset about things, take things personally, hold on to stuff, hold grudges, don't deal with it, gossip to other people, make things 10 times worse by not dealing with it directly, right? We can either deal with it directly, let it go, or choose door number 3, which is be constantly annoyed by it, feel victimized by it, complain to everyone else, blame that person, judge that person, gossip about them, all the things, on and on and on. That's way worse. Go back and at least try to deal with it directly. And if it doesn't work, then ask ourselves, could I let this go? Is this really a thing that I need to hold on to? And again, there are things in life we absolutely want to address. We don't want to step over. We don't want to just let people kind of railroad us and do certain things. I get it. But there's a bunch of stuff right now that you and I hang on to or are upset about that we could absolutely just let go and it would be fine. Like if you made a list of all the things right now in your life, whether it's in your marriage or, significant other relationship, whether it's in your family, whether it's at work, with your team, if you manage people, the folks you manage, if you don't manage people, just with your peers or projects or whatever's going on, made a list of all the things that were upsetting you or that were challenges or there were conflicts. Maybe that's a long list, maybe it's a short list, depending on what's going on in your life right now. But if you made that whole list and then went down the list and asked yourself, how many of these things could I let go? Like just genuinely let go. That would shorten the list, wouldn't it? And then the stuff that you can't authentically let go, then the question is, okay, how do I deal with this directly? Who could I talk to? What could I say? How could I potentially make this situation better, or at least attempt to make it better, or attempt to address it or resolve it? In some ways, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of the serenity prayer, right? What is it? God grant me the serenity to change the things that I can change, accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's profound when you really think about it. What can I change? What can I deal with directly that I could resolve? What can I accept and just realize that's just the way it is? That's just the way they are. That's just the nature of it. Those are the rules of this game. Like there's a story, I've probably shared this story here on the show before, but when Samantha, our 18-year-old, was 6, she signed up to play softball. And she was on a team of 6 and 7-year-old girls softball. And it was super cute. And I was one of the assistant coaches and I would help out at practice. And, I played baseball all those years. So I'm not very helpful with certain sports like volleyball and soccer that I never played and I don't really know much about. But with softball, I could help. So I'm out there helping. And there was this one sweet little girl on the team. And we were teaching the girls the rules and getting them set. And they're little, right? 6, 7 years old. And when she would hit the ball at practice, she would run to third base. At first it was kind of cute. No, she's confused. And, oh, honey, you got to run that way. First base, then second, then third. Okay. She did it a few times. And finally, at one point, after 3 or 4 times of just hitting the ball and running to third base, I was like, I didn't get mad at her, but I was like, you have to go to first base. And she was like, I don't want to go to first base. I want to go to third base. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you, but if you want to play softball, these are the rules. You got to go to first, then second, then third. You can't just go straight to third. That's not the way it works. But it made me laugh because it was sweet and cute, but it's like, that's kind of like life. We're arguing with reality. We're arguing with the rules. We're arguing with the setup. And again, I'm not someone that thinks we should just be passive and just let things be as they are. If something could be better, if something needs to be addressed, if something needs to be changed, if we need to speak up, let's do that. But there are things in life that can't be changed, that's just the way it is. And we make ourselves miserable by constantly trying to change things that can't be changed or that's not in our purview or our responsibility to change. So can we just let it go? Can we just accept it? But like really do the inner work to let it go, because that will resolve the conflict. Again, you and I have let go of lots and lots and lots of things in our life, even big things. We don't think about them anymore. You know why? Because we let them go. So can we deal with it directly all the way through, utilizing lots of different tools and techniques and aspects of emotional intelligence and authenticity and vulnerability and right self-aware? Does it mean that every conflict we address directly is going to get resolved? No. Might sometimes it get worse? Yeah. Might we have to just agree to disagree? Might we feel a bit unsatisfied at the end of the process? And yeah, but dealing with it directly gives us a chance to resolve it. Letting it go authentically definitely gives us a chance to resolve it. Not dealing with it directly, not letting it go, whining, complaining, feeling sorry for ourselves doesn't really work. That's the thing we often do. And that's part of what makes conflict so problematic because dealing with it directly takes courage and skill. Letting it go takes a certain amount of maturity and mindset. Whining and complaining about it and feeling victimized by it, path of least resistance, what we tend to do most of the time, just not effective. Make sense? Look, conflicts arise in any relationship, in any team, in any family. There's either conflict or there's tension. The conflict can be healthy. The conflict can be productive. It can be constructive. It can really build our relationships, deepen trust, come up with new ideas, get us to a better place. The tension can often stress us out, push us further apart, diminish trust, diminish connection. So we want to lean into the conflict. It's not a bad word. It's not a bad thing. It's necessary. It's healthy. It's about us choosing to either deal with it directly or let it go. Those are the two ways to resolve conflict. Thanks for listening or watching. Always appreciate when you do that. Make sure you hit the subscribe button either to the YouTube channel here or the follow button in whatever podcast app or platform you happen to listen to. There's some links in the show notes or down below in the notes on the video where you can connect with me on social media or learn more about me and my work. Best place to do that is at our website, which is mike-robbins.com. Until next time, keep bringing your whole self to work. And remember, even when we're in conflict, we're all in this thing together.